He didn't know her name, didn't know why a child was screaming in the middle of the road or why her brother wasn't moving. But he stopped. And in that moment, everything changed. He took them in. Just for the night, he thought. Until he found the box, and the letters inside that told a story she never meant to leave behind. In a cabin built on grief, they stitched together something small, quiet, and unexpectedly whole. But peace has a cost. When the past returned in fire, he made the only choice his heart knew, to save what had saved him. From ashes and letters, they planted something that couldn't be taken, a home that was chosen, not inherited. If stories like this speak to the part of you still healing, subscribe now, because sometimes a stranger's kindness is how family begins. Now let's go back to where it all began, with a scream on County Road 12. The rain hadn't let up since late afternoon. It wasn't the kind that came in waves, but the steady, needling kind that turned gravel to slurry and hollow, roads into rivers. Jack Monroe leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the wipers as they dragged across the windshield of his old Ford. The heater coughed warm air that barely took the edge off the chill. Another gray Thursday in late October, and all he wanted was home. Just 10 more minutes, he thought. His hands were stiff on the wheel, calloused from years of carpentry and solitude. The town had grown quieter since the mill closed. He didn't mind. The fewer people, the fewer questions. And no one in Blue Hollow asked much anymore, least of all about the fire 5 years ago or the woman he'd buried after it. Jack had learned to live with quiet, which is why the scream hit him like a blade. It was high, sharp, and so sudden that it sliced through the hum of tires and wipers like a siren from another world. He slammed the brakes. The truck skidded slightly before stopping crooked on the roadside. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain, boots sinking into soft mud. The sound had come from somewhere ahead, just past the bend. And then, movement. A child, a little girl no more than 5, came into view from behind a crooked mile marker, barefoot and soaked to the skin. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her small body shaking as she stumbled forward, crying out again. Not words, just a sound of pure fear. Jack moved before thought could stop him. He caught her as she collapsed into him, arms clinging to his flannel jacket with desperate fingers. Hey, you're okay, you're all right now," he said softly, crouching to her eye level. "Where's your—" That's when he saw them. Just off the road near a sloped ditch lay a boy, maybe 8, unmoving, his jeans soaked and his shirt smeared with dirt. A few feet away, a woman, face down in the weeds, her dark hair tangled, her hand still reaching out toward the boy as if she'd tried to protect him even while falling. Something gripped Jack's chest. He handed the girl his coat and raced to the boy first. Knees in the cold mud, he pressed 2 fingers to the child's neck. Pulse. Faint, but there. The woman next. She was breathing, shallow and labored. He turned her gently. Her face was pale, lips bluish. One side of her forehead was bruised. She didn't stir. "Damn it," Jack muttered, already shrugging off his flannel. There was no cell service out here. No time to wait. With quick, practiced movements, reflexes he didn't realize he still had, he scooped up the boy and carried him to the truck, laid him gently across the back seat, then came back for the woman. She was light. Frighteningly so. Like someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. The little girl trailed behind him, silent now, her tiny feet slapping wet against the road. "Climb in," he told her gently. "It's warm in there." She obeyed without a word. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He drove. Back toward town, his mind racing faster than the wipers. The woman might be concussed. The boy needed warmth, maybe fluids, maybe more. He didn't know their names. Didn't know what they were doing out here on a back road in the middle of a storm. But he knew the look in that little girl's eyes. He'd seen it in the mirror more than once. That look that came after you lost something you couldn't name. Only feel. Jack's cabin sat just outside the edge of town, tucked behind a line of trees that had stood longer than he had. He pulled in, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and jumped out before the engine cut. He carried the boy inside first, laying him carefully on the old leather couch by the fire. Then the woman, placing her on the second-hand recliner he rarely used her. He turned the thermostat up, threw 2 logs into the stove and wrapped them both in wool blankets. The girl stood in the doorway, shivering. Water dripped from her sleeves to the floor. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling. She looked at him, wide-eyed, silent, and then walked over, sitting cross-legged near her brother, still holding Jack's flannel jacket tight around her shoulders. He didn't press. Instead, he moved to the kitchen and started boiling water. Ginger tea, the only thing he had besides instant coffee. The rain beat harder against the roof. Back in the living room, the fire cast warm gold against the walls. The boy stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering. The woman still hadn't woken, but her chest rose steadier now. Jack glanced toward the girl. She had fallen asleep against the couch, her head resting near her brother's arm, their hands just barely touching. That's when he saw it. Near the recliner, half tucked beneath the woman's soaked duffel bag, sat a small wooden box. Nothing fancy, just smooth pine, worn edges, a faded ribbon tied around the latch. Something about it made him pause. He knelt, lifted it gently. The box was heavier than it looked. He didn't open it, not yet. Jack placed it on the mantel just beside the framed photo of his wife, the one picture he hadn't boxed away after the fire. And as he stood there, staring into the flames, something stirred beneath all the walls he'd spent years building. A girl's scream had brought them here. But what had they left behind? And why did it feel like for the first time in years someone might need him again? Jack had always believed that silence spoke louder than words. And this silence, the kind that hung heavy in a room where 3 strangers slept beneath borrowed warmth, was deafening. The storm had passed sometime after midnight, leaving behind a stillness so thick it pressed against the windows like fog. Outside, the trees stood motionless, their branches glistening with rain. Inside, the fire had burned down to a low red cradle, casting soft pulsing light over the living room walls. Jack hadn't slept. He sat at the edge of the kitchen table, nursing the last of his lukewarm tea, watching. The boy, curled on the yao couch beneath a hand-me-down quilt, breathed steadily now, though his brow was still furrowed as if even in sleep, he didn't feel safe. The little girl was a quiet tangle of limbs on the rug, Jack's old flannel still draped around her shoulders, and the woman. She hadn't moved since he laid her in the recliner. Her chest rose and fell slowly as though each breath were hard-earned. The bruising on her temple had darkened, her lips still pale. But she was here, alive. He wasn't sure what had pulled, his eyes back to the box. It sat quietly on the mantel, untouched since he found it. Something about the way it had been tucked into the folds of the torn blanket, carefully hidden, wrapped like something precious, kept his hands from opening it. Until now. Jack stood, moved toward the hearth, and lifted it down with both hands. It wasn't locked, but the ribbon had been tied in a careful knot. Not decorative. Protective. He paused, then untied it. Inside he found letters. Dozens of them, some sealed, some not. All written on the same kind of lined, tear-away paper you'd find in a cheap spiral notebook. A few had smudges, water stains, maybe tears. Each was folded with deliberate care, and everyone was addressed the same way. To my babies. In case I can't say this out loud. To you when you're old enough to understand. To the part of me I left behind. Jack's breath caught. He took one out. The paper was thin, almost translucent in the firelight. Her handwriting was clean, rounded, delicate but steady. He didn't recognize her name at the bottom, only the way it had been signed. Mama. He placed the letter back without reading further. This wasn't his to open. Not yet. But it told him something he hadn't been sure of until now. Whoever she was, wherever she'd come from, this woman didn't expect to survive whatever she'd been running from. Jack set the box down gently, then turned as he heard a stirring from the recliner. She was waking. It was slow at first, fingers twitching beneath the blanket, a soft groan escaping her throat. Then her eyes blinked open, unfocused and glassy. He stepped closer but didn't. "Speak." She winced as she tried to sit up, hand flying to her temple. "Easy," Jack said, voice low, calm. "You took a pretty good hit to the head." Her eyes landed on him, confused. She looked past him, at the room, the fire, the window, and her whole body stiffened. Panic. "The kids," she croaked. "They're safe." "Sleeping," Jack assured. "They're warm, fed, and inside. You all are." She stared at him for a long moment, and something in her eyes shifted. Not relief, wariness. The kind that comes from being let down too many times to believe kindness is free. He could feel it. The pulling back, the instinct to bolt. "I'm not asking you anything," he added, backing up a step to give her space. "I just saw 3 people who needed help and stopped. That's all." Her shoulders slumped slightly, like a weight had pressed down on them and then given her permission to breathe. "I'm Jack Monroe. This is my place." She nodded, eyes darting toward the couch, where the boy slept. "I should go," she said hoarsely. "You shouldn't," Jack said simply. "You're hurt. The boy, your son, I'm guessing, was barely responsive when I found him. And your daughter." She ran into the road screaming. The woman's face crumpled slightly. She turned away, pressing her hands over her mouth as if trying to hold something in. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "You don't have to explain it to me." "I didn't want," she started but stopped herself. Jack didn't press. Instead, he crouched near the couch, adjusting the quilt over the boy. "What's his name?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "Ethan." "And the girl?" "Clara." Jack nodded, repeating them in his mind. "They can stay. You can too. Just till things settle." Her eyes flashed. "You don't know who I am." "No," Jack said. "But I know what you did." She blinked, confused. "You curled your body around 2 kids in the middle of a storm. Protected them. With everything you had. That tells me all I need for now." A silence stretched. Finally she spoke, voice small. "Elena." It didn't come with a last name. Jack didn't ask for one. "All right, Elena," he said, stepping back toward the kitchen. "I'll make coffee. You can rest or sit or leave. It's your choice. But the door's not locked. And it won't be." She didn't respond. But she didn't run either. And when Jack passed the mantel again, he glanced at the box. Still there. Still closed. He didn't know what her story was. But maybe she'd stayed long enough to one day tell it. The cabin had always been quiet in the mornings, but now it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was listening. Jack stood at the stove, flipping pancakes while the coffee brewed behind him, the old floorboards creaking under his bare feet. Outside, the trees wore the rain like a second skin, droplets catching the light as dawn stretched slow and gold across the pine. He used to love mornings like this, back when the house was full of movement and little feet running across the floor. Back when Allison was still humming in the kitchen beside him. He flipped the last pancake and exhaled. No humming now. But there were voices, small ones, from the living room. He leaned slightly to hear. "Your bear is wet," the little girl was saying. Jack peeked around the corner. Clara sat cross-legged on the rug, holding a threadbare stuffed bear with both hands, inspecting it like a nurse would inspect a patient. Her brother, Ethan, was propped up against the arm of the couch, pale, but awake. He nodded solemnly. "He doesn't like the rain," Ethan said. Clara gave the bear a squeeze. "I'll wrap him up like Mommy did to us." Jack smiled to himself, then caught the figure standing just inside the hallway. Elena. She was wearing one of his old sweatshirts, the sleeves rolled up over thin wrists. Her hair was damp from a shower. He didn't know how long she'd been there, or how long she'd been watching her children. She looked like a woman trying to remember how to breathe. Jack stepped back into the kitchen and busied himself with plates. "You hungry?" he asked when she came in. She paused. "I could eat." He passed her a plate and poured 2 mugs of coffee. "Nothing fancy," he said, "but it's hot and has maple in it." That's the extent of my hospitality. Elena sat stiffly at the small table, eyes flicking once to the mantel, then quickly away. She didn't mention the box, neither did he. "How's Ethan?" Jack asked, easing into the chair across from her. "Sleeping better. He still coughs. Probably the cold." She blew on the coffee before tasting it. "He's tough. They both are." Elena nodded slowly, tracing a finger along a faint scratch in the wood table. "You used to have kids?" she asked, eyes not leaving the grain. Jack looked up. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice quiet. "Her name was Molly." She glanced at him, then back down again. "I'm sorry. So am I." No more words, just shared stillness, as if grief were a room they both stepped into without knocking. She didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing leaves across the window pane like fingertips on glass. Inside, the fire crackled as if trying to fill the gaps between them. Later that morning, after breakfast, Jack found himself out in the shed sorting wood for the porch rail. It had warped in the last rain and he needed something to do with his hands. He hadn't expected Elena to follow him. "You build things?" she asked, stepping lightly over a puddle at the shed's threshold. "Sometimes, when I'm not fixing things." She ran her hand along a smoothed plank, eyes lingering on the knots. "My father used to say a man's soul shows in the way he shapes wood," she said. "It's the one thing you can't fake." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And what would this say about me?" She shrugged. "You're either honest or very, very tired." That pulled a chuckle from him. Maybe both. She bent down, picked up a block of pine, and held it to her chest. "I like this place," she said, almost too quietly. "It doesn't ask anything of me." Jack watched her. "I won't ask who you're running from," he said finally, "but I will ask if you feel safe here." Elena hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "I do now." He nodded once. That afternoon, Jack let Ethan and Clara help him sand down a bench by the front steps. It became a quiet project of sorts. One child on either side, sleeves too long, hands too small, but eager. He showed them how to move with the grain, how to let the wood tell them what it needed. They listened like it mattered. Elena stood on the porch for a while, watching the three of them in the soft light of a late autumn sun. Then she turned, walked back inside, and Jack noticed something shift in her walk. Less guarded, less hollow. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep curled on a pile of quilts in front of the fire, Jack stepped into the living room and found Elena sitting in the far armchair, arms wrapped around her knees. The wooden box sat on her lap. She didn't flinch when she saw him, just looked down and whispered, "I didn't want anyone to find it." Jack moved slowly to the chair opposite her. "I didn't read the letters." "I know." She opened the lid. "I started writing them when I thought I wouldn't make it out." Her voice cracked, and for the first time Jack saw the tremble beneath her calm. She pulled out a folded page, ran her fingers across the lines. "I wanted to leave something behind," she said, "in case my kids ever wondered who I really was. Before everything went wrong." Jack leaned forward slightly. "And who are you, Elena?" She looked up, and this time her eyes weren't guarded. "I don't know anymore." The fire popped in the silence. Jack sat back and crossed his arms. "Well," he said gently, "maybe you're someone figuring it out. One good day at a time." She smiled. Faint, but real. And for the first time since that rainy roadside night, Jack didn't feel like he was standing in someone else's storm. He felt like he'd invited someone in from the cold. Jack didn't know what made him leave the kettle on the stove that morning, but something about the sound, the slow whistle rising like a breath held too long, made him stop what he was doing. He stood still in the kitchen, waiting. Outside, the world was caught in that brief pause between late fall and winter. The leaves were gone, the sky hung low, and the trees stretched up like they were waiting for something too. Elena hadn't come down yet. The kids were at the small kitchen table, Clara drawing crooked hearts on the back of a junk mail envelope, Ethan still half wrapped in a quilt, slowly spooning oatmeal with the air of a boy who had learned not to waste food or time. You two okay for a minute? Jack asked. Ethan nodded. Clara grinned, maple syrup on her cheek. Jack walked down the hall and stopped outside the guest room door. He tapped lightly, then spoke through the crack. Elena? Just wanted to check in. No response. He was just about to step away when he heard her voice. Barely. Come in. The door opened with a tired creak. She was sitting on the bed, still in the oversized sweatshirt she'd slept in, her back against the wall. In her lap, the wooden box. Its lid open now, letters strewn across the quilt like autumn leaves in a wind that hadn't quite finished. What it started, she didn't look up at him. I was going to burn them, she said quietly. Jack stepped inside and shut the door. When? The night before you found us. She picked up one of the pages, creased, smudged at the corner, and held it between her fingers like it was both precious and poisonous. I had the match in my hand. The fire was already lit, but I couldn't do it. Jack sat on the small, rocking chair in the corner, its arm still wobbly. He hadn't fixed it. Maybe he'd left it broken on purpose. I'm glad you didn't, he said. She looked at him then, and in that look was something that hadn't been there before. Not suspicion, not fear, shame. You don't know what they'd say, she whispered. I don't have to, Jack replied. Elena closed her eyes. I wrote them at night, after the kids were asleep, when the house was dark and I couldn't cry out loud. Some of them are for Ethan and Clara, some are for no one, just the version of me I couldn't be in front of anyone else. She handed him a letter. Jack hesitated. You sure? Elena nodded, barely. He opened it gently, careful not to tear the fold. To the me I don't recognize anymore. You stayed, too long. You thought love would fix what was already broken. You thought if you were good enough, quiet enough, patient enough, he would stop blaming you for his failures. But he didn't. And when he died, they blamed you too. You let them. You let them say you were unworthy of his name, unfit for their blood, undeserving of the house you helped clean, the children you bore, the silence you swallowed. And now you're here with nothing but the children and the bruises you don't let them see. But you didn't run because you're weak. You ran because you remembered who you were before all of this. A girl who wanted to be a nurse. A girl who liked cinnamon candles and autumn rain and reading aloud to someone who listened. Find her. Even if it's in a stranger's house with hands that don't hurt and a fire that doesn't threaten, find her. Elena. When Jack looked up, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from recognition. He had written his own letter like that once. He just never had the courage to. Put it on paper, Elena, he said softly. You're still her. She gave a small, bitter smile. I don't know who I am, just who I'm not. That's a start. She pulled the box closer to her chest. I used to live in a house where nothing was mine, she said. Not the kitchen, not the blankets, not even the silence. Everything belonged to someone else's expectations. After my husband died, they told me I had no place there. His brother looked me in the eye and said I was a charity case they were tired of carrying. Jack's jaw tightened. They said I could leave, but the kids had to stay, that it was what my husband would have wanted, that I wasn't fit to raise them without guidance. And you left anyway. I had to. Her voice cracked. Even if I didn't know where I was going. Even if it meant. She stopped. Even if it meant showing up half dead on the side of a road, Jack finished for her. Elena wiped her eyes with the sleeve of the sweatshirt. I never wanted anyone to see me like this. Jack leaned forward. I lost my wife in a fire I couldn't stop. I've lived 5 years inside 4 walls because I was afraid of what I couldn't protect. So let me tell you something. Broken doesn't mean worthless. She held the box, tighter. I don't want pity. You're not getting any, Jack said. Just space, and maybe some pancakes if you're willing. That pulled a quiet laugh from her. The kind of laugh people make when they forgot they could. As she gathered the letters back into the box, she paused on one, newer, less folded. She held it up. This one I haven't finished yet, she said. Jack nodded. Still time. When they walked back into the kitchen, Ethan looked up with a mouthful of toast, Clara with syrup on her chin. Elena sat down beside them. No announcements, no explanation, just a mother returning to her seat at the table. And for Jack, that was enough. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed and the fire had burned to a low, comforting glow, Elena stood at the mantel. She picked up the box and whispered something to it before placing it back down. Jack didn't ask what she said, but he noticed the lid wasn't fully closed. The days that followed fell into a rhythm no one planned, yet no one resisted. Jack woke earlier than usual, as if some part of him was afraid the peace might slip away if he didn't witness it from the beginning. The cabin, once a place of shadows and clockwork solitude, now hummed with gentle motion. Footsteps on floorboards, whispered songs hummed at the sink, the quiet clink of spoons against mismatched bowls, and laughter. Small, uneven, sometimes, barely more than a breath, but it was there. Elena had taken to the kitchen in the mornings, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, eyes still carrying weariness, but no longer fear. She moved with care, like someone rediscovering the sensation of being useful without permission. She baked cinnamon biscuits on Tuesday. The scent filled the house like something holy. Jack stood by the open window, sanding the edge of a bench he'd meant to fix years ago. As he worked, curls of wood drifted down like pale snow. From inside, he could hear Clara giggling, Ethan asking questions only 5-year-olds would think to ask. Do clouds get tired? And Elena answering in that soft, patient tone she saved just for them. He paused, set the sandpaper down. This, he thought, was what living sounded like. They cleaned the porch together on Wednesday. Clara insisted on sweeping, even though the broom handle was twice her height, and she kept knocking over the potted fern that had somehow survived 4 winters, and no watering. Ethan helped Jack tighten the railing bolts. Elena mended a fraying quilt out front with a tin of spare buttons and thread she'd found tucked in the old sewing basket Allison had once used. No one asked if they were staying. They just were. That night, after dinner and the ritual of hot cocoa with too many marshmallows, Jack found himself standing beside Elena on the front steps. The sky was a deep navy, stars pressing through the chill. Inside, the kids had fallen asleep in front of the fire, curled around each other like kittens in a borrowed world. You always live this quietly? Elena asked. Jack gave a soft smile. Quiet isn't the same as empty. She nodded, arms folded, breath misting in the air. You ever think about leaving here? She added. Jack glanced toward the horizon, where the pines carved a jagged silhouette against the dark. Once, he said, the week after the fire, I packed a bag. I was going to drive until the gas ran out, but then I looked at the front porch and remembered Allison's boots still sitting there. Muddy, untouched, like she might come back for them. Elena didn't speak, but he saw the way her jaw shifted, her eyes pulling inward. I stayed because the pain was familiar, Jack added, and because I was afraid if I left, I'd take the silence with me. She looked at him gently. And now? He turned to her. Now, I'm starting to hear something else. On Friday, Ethan asked if he could help Jack build something just for us. So Jack pulled out scrap pine, some smooth cedar, and 2 old hinges he'd been saving. Together, they built a small toy chest, the kind you could sit on when you're 6 and hide your treasures in when you're 10. Ethan painted the lid sky blue. Clara insisted on adding stars. Elena sat nearby, sewing new patches into the kids' coats, her hands steady, her eyes often watching Jack. Not in suspicion, in something quieter, something wondering. That night, as the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the last of autumn's breath, Jack stepped into the kitchen and found Elena alone. She stood by the stove, stirring cider, a faint smile on her lips. You should open your own bakery, he said. She turned, eyebrow raised. I've had a good teacher, she replied. You make a decent breakfast. I survive, he shrugged. No, you care. There was a pause. Then she added more quietly, "It's been a long time since I cooked for someone who noticed." Jack leaned against the counter. "Well," he said, "I notice." Their eyes met. It didn't last long, but it didn't have, to something had shifted. On Sunday morning, the kids were drawing at the table. Clara handed Jack a piece of paper with 4 stick figures. One with a square head, Jack, she explained. One with long hair, Elena, and 2 tiny ones in between. Above them, a crooked little house. "Is this us?" Jack asked, grinning. "No, silly," Clara said seriously. "That's our house. We're inside it." Elena looked up from across the room. Their eyes met again. Not romantic, not yet, but honest. And full. That night, Elena placed a new letter in the box. Jack didn't read it, but when he passed the mantel later, he saw the top of the folded page. It began with, "Dear me today, my hands didn't tremble while making cocoa." No one raised their voice. No door slammed shut. I didn't apologize just for breathing. No one said I was too much or not enough. Today, we built a bench, and someone thanked me for being here. I think that counts as living again. Jack stood still. He didn't touch it, but the scent of cinnamon still lingered in the air, and for the first time in years, the sawdust on his shirt didn't feel like residue from yesterday. It felt like the beginning of something. Something worth building. The knock on the door came just after 3, when the sun had already begun its slow descent behind the hills, and the golden light filtered like honey through the cabin windows. Jack was sanding the last coat of varnish on the toy chest. When he heard it, 3 slow raps. Not hurried, not tentative, but exact. He wiped his hands on a rag, glanced over his shoulder. Elena was in the back room reading with the kids, the hush of their laughter weaving through the walls like thread. The knock came again. Jack stood, and something in his gut twisted. The man on the porch wore a dark overcoat and a jaw so tight it might have been carved from stone. His shoes were too clean for a place like Blue Hollow. His hair too perfect for a man who'd driven any real distance. The SUV behind him sat idling at the edge of the driveway, windows tinted black. He didn't smile. "You Jack Monroe?" Jack stepped outside, pulling the door halfway closed behind him. "Who's asking?" "Elena's brother-in-law, Simon Fields." Jack didn't offer a hand. "She's resting." "Figures," the man said, glancing past Jack toward the roofline. "She's good at hiding. Has been since my brother married her." Jack stiffened. "You come all this way to insult her?" "I came to take the children." A long pause, the kind that makes the trees seem quieter. Jack narrowed his eyes. "They're not yours to take. They're family. I have legal guardianship granted by the estate executor." Jack folded his arms, his voice steady. "She's their mother." Simon gave a cold, thin smile. "Biologically, yes. But legally, after what she's done?" "She saved their lives," Jack said, stepping forward. "I found them half frozen in a ditch because nobody else gave a damn where they were." "You don't know what you're stepping into," Simon said. "She didn't tell you, did she? About the will, the trust fund, the clause that removes her as guardian if she flees the property?" Jack's silence was answer enough. Simon adjusted his cuff. "My brother died with assets. Substantial ones. Elena stood to inherit control of a foundation, but she refused the role. My mother claimed she was unstable. There are documents, testimony. That little escape of hers only proved the point. She left because your family tried to take her kids," Jack growled. "And I don't need a judge to tell me what that makes you." Simon took a step forward. "Listen carefully. If you want to keep playing country host, fine, but I'll be back with papers, with law enforcement. You have 48 hours to turn them over." Jack didn't move, didn't blink. Simon looked at him like a man who expected to be obeyed, then turned and walked back to his SUV. The vehicle reversed without a sound. The tires didn't kick up gravel. It was like he had never been there at all. But Jack felt it, in his bones. Something had changed. Something had cracked. That night, he told Elena everything. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded as if she'd known it would come to this. They sent him, she said. Of course they did. Jack sat across from her at the kitchen table, the kettle steaming quietly in the background. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the pine wood floor. They said they had papers, Jack said carefully. But if we fight, they'll fight back harder, she interrupted. They always do. He studied her face. What did he mean? About the foundation? The will? Elena looked down at her hands. They were clasped too tightly, her knuckles pale. My husband's family is old money, New England dynasties. Press appearances, charities, ivory walls you never see the inside of unless you're born to it or married in. And even then you're never really inside. She took a breath. When Aaron died, they were terrified the public would see what really went on behind their perfect curtains. So they erased him, and then they tried to erase me. Jack's voice was quiet. Why didn't you take the inheritance? Because it wasn't money, it was control. Of everything, even my kids. Her voice caught. I thought if I left, if I took Ethan and Clara and just vanished, maybe they'd forget. Maybe we could just be people again. Jack leaned forward, voice low. They don't want those kids. They want power over you. Elena nodded. They always did. Silence wrapped around them like the wind outside. It shook the window panes. It tested the door. Jack looked at her then, really looked. Past the bruises, past the fear. Into the woman who had crawled through a life that tried to bury her, clutching her children in one arm and a wooden box of letters in the other. He spoke softly. You're not alone anymore. She looked at him. And in that moment, something opened, not hope, not yet, but something like belief. At midnight, Jack stood on the porch, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the trees. There was no car now, no knock. Just the hush before winter settles in for good. He thought of Molly, of how he'd failed once before to protect the people he loved. Then he thought of Elena, asleep beside her children, trusting him with the space she used to guard with everything she had. He whispered into the dark. If they come for you, they're going through me. And the wind, soft and cold, seemed to answer, then be ready. The wind shifted at dusk. Jack felt it in his chest before he saw it, the pressure change, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. The sky over Blue Hollow had turned strange, a reddish tint bleeding through the clouds like an omen. He stood by the porch rail, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. The kids were inside, building forts from couch cushions. Elena was in the kitchen, rolling dough with a patience that hadn't come easy. For 5 days they'd lived in something that resembled peace, worn, humble, fragile but real. And now the air smelled wrong. Smoke. It was faint. Not from the stove. Not from the fire pit out back. From somewhere else. Jack turned, alert now. The scent was growing. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the shed. That's when he saw it, a flicker in the trees, far off, near the road. Too orange, too fast. His breath caught. He turned back toward the house just as the back window shattered. The kitchen lit up behind him in a bloom of orange and gold. Elena! He dropped the mug. It hit the steps and shattered as he sprinted inside. The fire had crawled through the back wall like a beast let in. Cabinets hissed and cracked. Flames danced along the ceiling, hungry and wild. Elena! He shouted again, coughing as the smoke thickened. She emerged from the hallway, Clara clutched in her arms, Ethan stumbling beside her, barefoot and terrified. The back! Jack barked. Go now! She didn't argue. He grabbed Ethan, pulled the boy into his chest and pushed through the front door. The cold hit like a slap, but it was clean air, breathable, safe. He laid Ethan down on the porch, turned to grab the quilt by the rocker and ran back in. Elena stood in the doorway, frozen. The box, she gasped. It's still... Jack didn't hesitate. He shoved the quilt into her arms. Get the kids to the truck, start the engine, I'll be right there. She opened her mouth to argue, but then nodded and ran. The flames had reached the living room now, clawing up the walls. The mantel was glowing. Jack threw his arm over his mouth and charged in. The box sat where it always had, beside the frame, of Allison and Molly, untouched by time, by chaos, by mercy. He grabbed it, tucked it under his arm, and turned. The ceiling cracked. He dove. The world exploded in heat and timber and light. He woke to coughing. Cold air. Flashing red. The sting of snow on his cheek. He blinked, vision slow to return. Elena knelt over him, her hands on his face. Jack, please. I'm okay, he rasped. He wasn't. His shoulders screamed, his lungs burned, but he was, breathing, alive, and in his arms, still, was the box. The fire raged behind them, devouring the cabin in crackles and howls. Elena sobbed, her forehead pressed to his, both of them kneeling in the snow. Clara cried from the truck. Ethan's voice cracked through the air, calling for Jack. Jack wrapped his free arm around Elena, pulling her in tight. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the kind of moment that rooted itself in silence, and, she whispered through tears, I thought I'd lost you too. He pulled back just enough to look at her. Smoke curled into the sky behind them. Sparks flew upward like dying stars. But here, on this patch of frozen earth, they were still standing, still choosing. His voice came hoarse, cracked. I thought I couldn't love again. Elena stared, and he finished, voice trembling. But I was wrong. She blinked, lips parting. I'm scared, she whispered. He nodded. Me too. Then, stronger. But if I had to do it again, if it meant saving you, saving them, I'd do it every time. She closed her eyes. And when they opened again, something had changed in them. Not just relief, but trust. The firefighters arrived minutes later, sirens echoing down the hills. The flames were too far gone to be stopped. The cabin collapsed inward, swallowing 20 years of memories in a single breath. Jack sat on the tailgate of the truck wrapped in a blanket. Elena sat beside him, both kids huddled against her sides. The box sat in Jack's lap, scorched at the corners, damp with sweat and snow, still intact. He opened the lid slowly, letting the smell of smoke rise into the air. The letters were there, edges, singed ink slightly blurred but whole. Elena looked over his shoulder, silent. He lifted the top letter, a new one, written in fresh ink, barely dry, Elena's handwriting. He unfolded it, read silently, the world narrowing to paper and breath and the soft, distant crackle of dying fire. Dear Hope, tonight a man who owed me nothing ran into fire to save the pieces of me I thought were already lost. He didn't ask who I used to be. He just saw who I still was. Your uncle tried to burn us out of hiding, but it didn't work, because some things can't be erased. Not by flame, not by fear. We are still here. We are still choosing love. And that, my girl, is how you survive. Mama Jack folded the letter, hands trembling. He looked at Elena. She met his eyes. Thank you, she said, voice soft. Sure. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked toward the smoldering ruin of his home, the porch where Molly used to sit, the kitchen where Allison once danced. Gone. But next to him, Ethan leaned against his side, and Clara had curled her fingers into his coat. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. We'll build again. Elena nodded. We will. By morning only. The chimney remained. It stood like a stone sentinel among the ash, blackened and upright, watching over the charred ribs of what used to be a home. The smoke had thinned, rising in soft wisps as if even the fire had grown tired of taking. Jack stared at the wreckage from the hood of the truck, blankets still wrapped over his shoulders, his body aching in ways he hadn't expected. Not just from the burns or bruises, but from the loss that came after the heat, the kind that didn't roar, but whispered. He hadn't slept. Beside him, the kids still dozed in the back seat, curled into each other beneath a borrowed quilt. Elena sat cross-legged in the passenger seat, holding a mug of weak coffee in both hands. Her eyes were red but dry, her face pale but steady. Neither had said much since the fire. Words hadn't found them yet, but the box had. Jack looked down at it now, resting between them, still here, still whole. It felt impossible. When the flames had licked through the walls, when the roof had groaned and collapsed, he'd thought everything was gone. But somehow, the little wooden box had survived, scorched at the edges. The ribbon singed clean through but intact. He hadn't opened it again. Not yet. It didn't feel like it was his to touch until the world stopped spinning. Elena reached out now, her fingers brushing the lid. "I started this box when I was 25, she said, her voice low. "Before Ethan was born. Back when I still believed someone would love me gently." Jack looked at her. She didn't meet his gaze, just kept tracing the worn corner with her thumb. "I used to write at night," she continued. "Mostly to my kids, but sometimes to myself. Like I was trying to hold a future together with paper and ink." Jack nodded slowly. "Maybe you did." Elena smiled faintly. "Maybe." They sat in silence for a while. The wind shifted through the trees. A bird called once like a question left unanswered. Then Elena opened the lid. Inside, beneath the folded letters and fire-damp pages, lay something Jack hadn't noticed before. A photograph. She pulled it out carefully. It was crinkled, the edges curled with age, but the image was clear. A younger version of Elena, standing beside a man with a sharp jaw and polished smile. Her eyes in the photo looked tired even then. Jack didn't ask. She set it aside and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper from the bottom, clean, unburned. She found a pen in the glove box. Then she began to write. Jack watched the motion of her hand. No hesitation. No false starts, just steady, quiet ink. When she was done, she didn't read it. She folded it once, then twice, and slipped it back into the box. "For me," she said. "Not for Hope. Not for Ethan or Clara. Just me." Jack nodded. Some letters were meant to be written, even if no one ever read them. Elena looked out at the remnants of the cabin. "I never had a place that felt like mine," she whispered. "Even when I was married. Even when the house was big and the rugs were white and the glasses were crystal. Nothing ever really belonged to me." She paused. "But that kitchen, those floorboards, your broken coffee mug by the sink. I think that was the first place that ever felt like mine." Jack's throat tightened. "I thought I'd already lost everything that could be taken from me," he said. "But when I saw the fire, when I thought you might still be inside, I realized I was wrong." He looked at her, voice barely above the wind. "I couldn't lose you." Elena met his eyes then, and in hers Jack saw the weight of years, of choices and shame, of silence and survival, but also something he hadn't seen before. Permission. She reached for his hand. "I'm still here," she said simply. He took it, not urgently, not desperately, but with both hands, steady, certain. By midday, Sheriff Lowry arrived. He stood at the edge of the wreckage, his wide hat pulled low, his hands in his coat pockets. "You all right?" he asked. Jack nodded. "We're breathing." "That's something?" Lowry squinted at the ruins. "Folks in town are already organizing. Maggie from the bakery's making casseroles. The Moores are offering a trailer for the short term. Hank wants to donate lumber." Jack blinked. "That fast?" Lowry shrugged. "People remember what you did when that barn fire broke out 2 summers ago. You didn't ask questions, you just showed up." He looked at Elena then. "And when a man runs into a burning house with no shoes on to save his family, folks take note." Elena lowered her gaze. Lowry tipped his hat. "We'll help you rebuild. That's what we do." That night, they stayed in a borrowed camper, parked beside the still warm ruins. Ethan and Clara fell asleep early, their bodies finally surrendering to safety. Jack and Elena sat on the camper steps, the box between them. a blanket over their shoulders. You think we'll find a new rhythm? She asked. Jack smiled. We'll make one. Elena looked down at the box, fingers gently stroking its lid. I used to write as if no one would ever read it. Now, I write hoping someone will. Jack leaned his head against hers. I will. And as the stars blinked overhead, quiet, indifferent, eternal, Jack thought of all the things that hadn't burned. Not just the box, but hope. The kind that doesn't arrive with grand promises, just the simple presence of someone willing to stay. It started with a hammer. Hank Moore showed up on a foggy Tuesday morning, long before the frost had melted off the truck windows. He didn't knock, just walked across the soft earth where the porch used to be and set a toolbox down in the ash with a quiet grunt. Figured we'd start with the footing, he said. That old slope of yours never drained right. Jack stood beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes still heavy from too little sleep and too many memories. You don't have to do this, Hank. Hank looked at him, then down at the ground. Sure I do. That was the end of the conversation. The next day, Maggie brought coffee and biscuits. She didn't say much either. Just placed a tin on the tailgate of Jack's borrowed truck and kissed Clara on the head like she'd always been part of her morning route. By Friday, the lot buzzed with voices and clinking tools. Someone had donated lumber. Someone else delivered insulation. Sheriff Lowry brought paint samples even though no one had asked him to. Maisie, Jack's young neighbor from across the ridge, brought her father's old measuring tape and measured every beam twice. No one asked for money. No one mentioned insurance. They just showed up. Because that's what people do when they remember who stood beside them when the wind got sharp. Jack worked without pause. It wasn't just distraction, it was survival. He nailed beams like he was building bone, carved joists like he was restoring memory. Each board fitted into place felt like a sentence he'd been too afraid to write. I'm still here. I still want to live. Elena joined him by the third day. She didn't ask permission, she just picked up a paintbrush and started working. The kids played nearby, Clara with sidewalk chalk, Ethan helping carry short planks with the solemnity of a boy who knew the difference between real work and make-believe. Elena wore her sleeves rolled, a streak of blue on her cheek by noon. Her hair tied back, face flushed from effort. She looked free. At one point, Jack caught her standing still beside the half-framed porch, eyes closed, hand resting on a fresh post. He didn't interrupt. He knew what she was doing. She was remembering, and she was choosing to stay. That evening, after the tools had been packed up and the workers had drifted home, Jack and Elena sat on the steps of the unfinished porch. The sunset was gentle that night, bruised pink and gold across the sky. The trees swayed quietly, no longer strangers. Jack handed her a mug of cider. Elena took it, her hands warmer now. I've been trying to write again, she said after a while. Anything good? Jack asked, sipping his own. She shrugged. Not good, just true. Jack looked over at her. Sometimes that's the same thing. She smiled softly, then reached into the front pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out a small folded letter. This one isn't for the box, she said. He took it, hesitated, then unfolded it slowly. Dear Jack, I don't know how to thank someone who gave me back my name. You didn't ask who I used to be. You didn't ask me to prove I belonged. You just made space beside you. And when I fell apart, you didn't flinch. You held the pieces. You built a table that seated 4, even when the roof was missing. You stood between me and the dark, even when the fire was still licking at your heels. You said you couldn't love again, but you did. And that means I can too. Elena. Jack folded the letter slowly, carefully. His throat was tight, but his voice was clear when he spoke. I didn't know I still had room in me, he said. You didn't make room, she replied. You just stopped guarding the door. He reached over then, slowly, and took her hand, not as a question, as a choice. And Elena let him. They planted the promise tree that Sunday. It was Ethan's idea. We should put something here, he'd said, pointing to the spot where the old porch ended and the new boards began. So it knows we're not leaving again. So they did. An ash sapling from the nursery just outside town, barely waist high but rooted deep. Clara tied a red ribbon around the base. Elena tucked one of her earliest letters, never sent, into the dirt before the roots were packed down. Jack drove the stake beside it and patted the soil firm with the palm of his hand. They all stood there afterward, quiet and still, as if blessing, something they hadn't known how to ask for. Not a second chance, but a beginning, a place they could stay and grow, even if it took time, even if it took everything. That night, Jack stood on the porch they'd built, one rail still missing, the duck, paint only half dry, and watched the wind move through the newly turned soil. Behind him, the kids slept. Elena wrote by the fire. The box sat nearby, its lid slightly ajar. But out here, in the hush of blue evening and wood smoke, Jack breathed deep. The past was still there, ashes and ache. But so was something else. The sound of children's laughter, fading into dreams. The smell of fresh-cut pine, and a tree barely standing but determined to grow. Spring came slowly to Blue Hollow, as it always did. The thaw didn't arrive in a rush, but in touches, snowmelt trickling down the eaves, crocuses poking like soft declarations through the cold ground, light staying just a little longer each evening. The rebuilt porch smelled of fresh pine and sunlight. The wood creaked in a way that was already becoming familiar. And at the edge of it, just beyond the final step, the promise tree stood, still small, still fragile, but alive. It had weathered its first frost. Its thin trunk now bore tiny buds the color of new hope. Beneath it sat a wooden box, not hidden, not protected, just placed, like it belonged there. Jack stood in the doorway watching Elena braid Clara's hair at the foot of the porch. Ethan sat cross-legged beside them, carefully sketching the tree in a notebook he now guarded like treasure. He'd written on the first page, "This is where it started." Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon again. The same scent that had once felt like memory now felt like home. The sound of the kettle warming. The tick of a wall clock Jack had restored himself, and laughter. The kind that rose slowly and stayed long after the moment passed. Jack walked outside and sat beside Elena. She glanced up and smiled. "Morning," she said, voice soft and sunlit. "Morning," he replied, then looked at the tree. "It's growing. So are we," she murmured. He nodded. They sat in the quiet for a long while. Then Elena reached behind her and pulled out a new envelope, sealed, heavier than the others. She didn't hand it to him. She walked barefoot across the grass and knelt beside the box. She opened the lid and placed the envelope gently inside. Jack joined her, one knee in the soft earth. "Who's that one for?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Us." They closed the box together. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jack stood beside the fireplace, running his fingers along the mantel. The photo of Allison and Molly still stood in the center. It always would, but now beside it were new pictures. A crayon drawing of their porch with 4 smiling stick figures. A Polaroid of Ethan holding Clara's hand beneath the promise tree. A handwritten card from the Moore family that simply read, "Still here, still with you." He heard soft steps behind him. "Elena." She leaned against the doorway, holding a folded blanket in one hand, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked quietly. Jack looked around the room. "No," he said truthfully. "But I think I was waiting for it." She crossed to him, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. He met her eyes. "Neither am I." There were no grand declarations, no fireworks, just her head resting on his shoulder and the crackle of the fire behind them. Sometimes healing doesn't come like a revelation. It comes like a quiet, chosen breath beside someone who stayed. The next morning, Clara skipped outside first. She stopped by the tree, placed a smooth stone beside the box and whispered something no one else heard. Ethan followed, setting a small wooden carving on the edge, his first finished project. Jack joined them last, kneeling again beside the promise tree. He reached into the box and pulled out the top letter, folded in a child's careful handwriting. Clara had written it the night before, then tucked it in when no one was looking. He unfolded it slowly. Dear tree, thank you for not leaving when it got cold. We didn't either. Love, Clara. Jack smiled. His chest ached in the best way. He looked up. Elena stood on the porch, one hand over her heart, eyes damp with something he understood all too well. Gratitude that can't be spoken aloud. He rose and joined her. She reached for his hand. And this time, he didn't just take it. He held it like a vow, not for forever, but for today and tomorrow and the days they would choose to stay. That afternoon, with the sun high and the wind warm, Jack carved something into the tree's first stake. Simple, crooked, and true. We built this. Together. As the wind rustled the new leaves, the letters inside the box remained still. Because now, they were no longer just stories left behind. They were the roots of something growing. Epilogue. Beneath the tree months later, after the porch lights had been strung, after the front door had been painted sunflower yellow, after the mailbox had been painted with 4 names, Jack, Elena, Ethan, Clara, they sat together beneath the tree. The kids dozed in the grass. The stars blinked overhead. And in the quiet, Elena whispered the words she'd once written in a letter but never said out loud. I came here thinking I had nothing left, but you gave me everything I'd never known how to ask for. Jack turned to her, kissed the top of her head and whispered back, you never had to ask. The box rested at the base of the tree, not as a secret, not as a memory, but as a promise. If this story touched your heart, stay with us, because sometimes all it takes is one quiet act of kindness to begin again, and sometimes a box left behind becomes the home we never knew we needed. Some stories don't end with a kiss or a goodbye. They end with a choice. To stay. To rebuild. To believe that love can come quietly and grow beside a tree we promised to water. If this story left something warm in your chest, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and come back next time for another story about ordinary people who chose love over fear and kindness over silence.